So this is part 3 of the Panama Canal as a U.S. colony. Let's get into it. So this new Panama Canal Treaty goes into effect, and we are now on a 25-year plan to transfer the ownership of the Panama Canal from the United States to Panama. The first thing that happens when this treaty goes into effect is that the Panama Canal zone is no longer a part of the United States. Up until now, it has been a United States colony. It has been a territory. We call our colonies territories, by the way. So it has been a U.S. territory, which means that United States laws are in effect, that this place is governed by and is protected by the United States. That Panama Canal zone is now a part of Panama, which means the governing body of the United States territory is disbanded. And everybody who lives and works in the canal zone now lives and works in Panama. And you can imagine that a lot of the American workers who maybe had lived there their whole lives, some people were born there, so born and raised in this United States territory, did not necessarily like now becoming a part of Panama. And there's some people who lived and worked in the canal zone who weren't super cooperative with treaty implementation, might have slow-walked some of the reforms, some of the pieces of the treaty administration, because they were kind of hoping that maybe the political winds would change and that they would somehow go back to being a U.S. territory, which did not in fact happen. But for the first 10 years of the treaty being in place, things were moving forward. The committee that was made up of half United States administrators and half Panamanian administrators was working together to make this smooth transition of power between the U.S. and Panama. However, General Torrijos is killed in a plane crash. Why was he killed in a plane crash? Well, we don't know. But he was in the midst of implementing democratic government reforms. He was a dictator, but he was a reform-minded dictator. So he had been in the process of starting to implement democratic processes in Panama. And he then dies in a plane crash. Was it a plane crash that was caused by the United States? We don't know. Was it a plane crash that was caused by the man who took power after he died, General Noriega? We don't know. But what we do know is that he died in a plane crash right after he started to implement democratic reforms. So make of that what you will. But after his death, another general took power in Panama, and that is a name that a lot of you may recognize. If you, like me, were young in the 70s and 80s, you might recognize the name General Manuel Noriega. So Manuel Noriega was not particularly interested in reform, and he was not interested in being cooperative with the United States, and he was not anywhere near as popular as Torrijos had been. And when rumors started to circulate that maybe Noriega had been somehow involved in the death of Torrijos, as some former members of the Torrijos administration accused him of, there was mass protests by the people in Panama. These protests were broken up by paramilitary groups that were sponsored by Noriega, who went and beat the people who were protesting with batons and otherwise roughed them up violently. So there was violence and unrest under Noriega in Panama. Because of this violence, and also I think because the United States found him to be an uncooperative partner, the U.S. imposed sanctions, economic sanctions, on the Noriega government. This had an immediate and intense effect on the people of Panama. These economic sanctions meant that the banking system in Panama essentially collapsed. So the banks ran out of money. There was no money. So the people who were United States citizens who were still living and working in the canal, in the former canal zone, essentially couldn't have bank accounts. And so in order to pay the people who worked on the Panama Canal, the Panama Canal Zone administrators had to have millions of dollars, something like $7 million every 2 weeks, in cash sent from the United States, and then they would hand it out in cash to their employees because those employees could not cash a check at a bank. So it was devastating to the government, it was devastating to the economic life of Panama. Like, it was devastating to have these sanctions. And Noriega was very much trying to get the US to end these sanctions, and he did that by making life difficult for people who lived in the Canal Zone. He did things like say that anyone who worked for the Panama Canal could not receive any Panamanian governmental services, which included things like they couldn't renew their driver's licenses, they couldn't renew their vehicle licenses, they couldn't register their cars. And so the Panama Canal administrators had to hire buses to take their employees from where they lived to work at the Panama Canal Zone because they couldn't register their cars. And Noriega went so far as to kidnap some of the Panamanians who worked in the Canal Zone and torture them and otherwise intimidate them to try and pressure the United States to end these sanctions. So tensions escalated between the Noriega government and the government of the United States. And the government of the United States decided that they were going to use that part of the treaty that said that they could intervene in Panamanian governmental affairs if they felt like something was happening that was a threat to the canal. And so they sent 30,000 troops to remove General Noriega from power. They invaded the country of Panama. Now, the result of that invasion was that Noriega was removed from power, that democratic processes were able to be put in place in Panama, and that the implementation of the US-Panama Treaty was able to move forward. So in that sense, it worked out. But was the only way that the United States could have dealt with General Noriega's government to invade? I don't think so. And the cost of that invasion was loss of life and trauma for the Panamanian people. Would they say that it was worth it for the US to invade? Was there no other option? I think it was a really, really questionable decision at best and immoral decision at worst. And the cost for the Panamanian people of that invasion was high. But Noriega was removed. A democratic government was installed in Panama. And in 1999, Panama was given sovereignty over the Panama Canal. The Panamanian government in the last 25 years has administered the canal that was always theirs and should have always been theirs.